40 German heavy fighters leveling their wings for a synchronized rocket launch. A lone P-51 Mustang diving not toward the enemy, but straight into the crosshairs meant for the bombers. And one pilot whose calculations told him this was the only move that made sense, even as his wingman screamed that he'd just murdered everyone. They thought Jasper Clements had lost his mind. 3 minutes later, the sky was full of wreckage, none of it American. February 1944 hung over Germany like an iron shroud. The 8th Air Force had launched Operation Argument. The planners called it Big Week, a desperate gamble to break the Luftwaffe's spine before the invasion of Europe. Massive bomber streams carved contrails across the Reich, their aluminum fuselages glinting in the thin winter sun, while below, the factories of the Third Reich churned out fighters faster than the Allies could destroy them. This was the apex of industrial warfare in 3 dimensions. B-17 flying fortresses flew in defensive formations called combat boxes, geometric porcupines of overlapping machine gun fire designed to turn the sky into a wall of lead. In theory, no German fighter could penetrate that steel hedge without being shredded. In practice, the Luftwaffe had evolved. By February, the Zerstörter squadrons, heavy twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110s bristling with 210mm rockets, had perfected a new execution method. They no longer needed to close within machine gun range. They simply formed up at 1,000 yards, launched their BR-21 Werfergranate rockets in devastating salvos, and watched entire bombers disintegrate before the gunners could even track their attackers. It was murder at distance, clinical and efficient. Loss rates that had once climbed to 20% now threatened to spike higher. The bomber crews knew it, the fighter escorts knew it, and Major Klaus Vogt, the Luftwaffe commander they called the Butcher, had refined the tactic into an art form of methodical violence. Into this crucible flew Jasper Clements, a former engineering student who carried a slide rule in his flight suit and viewed the sky as nothing more than a 3-dimensional grid. He didn't believe in heroics or valor. He believed in angles, velocity, and the cold mathematics of survival. And on this day, the math was about to get very interesting. Jasper Clements didn't see formations the way other pilots did. Where his squadron mates saw courage and firepower, he saw vectors and blind spots. Where the mission planners saw defensive geometry, he saw structural flaws that kept him awake at night. The combat box was supposed to be perfect. 18 B-17 flying fortresses arranged in 3 staggered layers, high, lead, and low, with each bomber positioned to cover the vulnerable zones of its neighbors. Every aircraft bristled with 13.5 caliber machine guns, creating overlapping fields of fire that could theoretically shred any fighter foolish enough to press an attack. The doctrine called it a mutual support formation. Clements called it a mathematical compromise with fatal assumptions. He'd spent 3 months studying the geometry during briefings, sketching diagrams in the margins of his navigation charts while other pilots played cards or wrote letters home. The other P-51 pilots thought he was odd, too quiet, too intense, obsessed with angles and closure rates instead of kill counts and glory. His crew chief once found him in the hangar at 0200 hours using string and pushpins to model firing cones on a makeshift grid stretched across the concrete floor. The problem, as Clements saw it, was that the combat box assumed rational behavior from the enemy. It assumed German fighters would attack from the beam or the stern, where the massed defensive fire was strongest. It assumed they'd close to within 400 yards, where the bombers' guns could track and saturate the approach vector. But the Zerstörter squadrons weren't playing by those assumptions anymore. The BR-21 rockets had a reach of 1,000 yards, far beyond the effective range of the bombers' defensive fire. The German pilots could sit in the formation's dead zone, take their time lining up the entire box, and launch a wall of high-explosive warheads before a single 50-caliber round could touch them. Clements had calculated the exact problem 3 weeks ago. The combat box was a fortress designed to repel an enemy willing to breach the walls. Against an enemy with siege artillery, it was a killing pen. He'd written it up, submitted it to the operations officer, and watched it get filed away with a polite nod and zero follow-up. Now, climbing through 15,000 feet over the English Channel, with his finger tracing circles on his kneeboard calculations, Clements wondered if today would be the day his math became prophecy. 300 miles east, Major Klaus Vogt stood in the operations room at Wunstorf Airfield, watching the plots accumulate on the situation map like a disease spreading across tissue. Each red marker represented an American bomber stream, each one a target-rich opportunity that made his pulse quicken with something close to joy. Vogt didn't fly for the fatherland or the Führer or any of the ideological theater that dominated the propaganda reels. He flew because daylight interception had become the purest expression of his particular talent, the orchestration of industrial-scale killing with surgical precision. Other commanders spoke of honor in combat, of the chivalry between warriors meeting in the sky. Vogt found such romanticism tedious. This was mathematics wearing a uniform, and he was very good at math. The BR-21 rocket had transformed him from a competent fighter leader into an architect of massacre. Before the Wurfgranate, intercepting bomber formations meant closing to knife-fighting range, enduring the storm of defensive fire, and accepting attrition as the cost of doing business. Vogt had lost good pilots that way, men shredded by American gunners before they could land a killing blow. But the rockets changed everything. Now his Zerstera pilots could form up at standoff range, stabilize their aim, and deliver high explosive justice from beyond the reach of the bomber's futile defensive fire. It wasn't combat anymore. It was execution by committee, and Vogt ran the committee with the efficiency of a factory foreman. His crews called him the Butcher behind his back. He'd heard the nickname and felt nothing but satisfaction. Butchers fed nations. Butchers kept people alive through winter. Butchers performed essential work that required a strong stomach and steady hands. If the Americans wanted to send their boys into German airspace in aluminum coffins, Vogt would oblige them with professional courtesy and maximum efficiency. The morning's intelligence reported a lagging formation, 12 B-17s struggling to maintain position with the main bomber stream, isolated, vulnerable. Vogt smiled the way a wolf smiles at a wounded deer. He'd already scrambled 40 fighters, triple the number needed for a guaranteed kill. Overkill wasn't wasteful when you were making a statement. He checked his watch, calculated the intercept geometry, and reached for his flight helmet. Today would add another dozen American bombers to his tally, and tonight he'd update his logbook with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. If you believe people should be treated fairly and hate bullies like Vogt, comment, "I stand for justice." Only trolls side with the Butcher. The strategic planners at 8th Air Force Headquarters called it Operation Argument. The crews who flew it called it Big Week. The generals who conceived it called it the last roll of the dice before D-Day made gambling impossible. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. The invasion of Europe would fail if the Luftwaffe controlled the skies over Normandy. Every simulation, every war game, every strategic assessment reached the same conclusion. German fighters strafing the beaches would turn the landing craft into floating coffins and the shoreline into a graveyard. The Allied air forces had to break the Luftwaffe's back before the first soldier touched French sand. But how do you destroy an enemy that refuses to engage on your terms? For months, the bomber streams had pounded German industry while Luftwaffe commanders hoarded their fighters, refusing to commit their strength except when victory was assured. The Germans could afford to be patient. They manufactured fighters on their own soil, trained pilots in their own airspace, and only attacked when the math favored them overwhelmingly. Operation Argument aimed to change that calculation. The plan was elegantly vicious. Launch maximum effort missions against targets the Germans couldn't ignore. The aircraft factories at Regensburg, the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the assembly lines at Leipzig. Force the Luftwaffe to defend or watch their war machine collapse. Then, when every German fighter climbed to meet the bombers, the American escorts would be waiting to turn the sky into an abattoir. February 20th through 25th, 1944. 6 days of sustained assault.
3,000 bomber sorties, countless fighter sweeps, the largest sustained air campaign in human history, designed not to destroy factories, but to draw the Luftwaffe into a battle of annihilation it couldn't refuse. The theory was sound. The execution was proving costly. The Germans weren't simply defending, they were innovating. The BR-21 rockets, the standoff attacks, the massed formations that overwhelmed escort coverage through sheer numerical superiority. Big Week was supposed to be the Luftwaffe's funeral. Instead, it was becoming a mutual bloodletting, where both sides fed young men into the sky and counted the wreckage afterward. Clements understood all of this because the intelligence officers had explained it during the pre-dawn briefing. Maximum effort, expect heavy resistance, protect the bombers at all costs, the usual abstractions that meant everything and nothing. What they hadn't mentioned was what happened when the math failed and one pilot found himself alone against 40. The radio crackled with static, then silence. Not the comfortable silence of empty airspace, but the pregnant quiet that meant someone had stopped transmitting mid-sentence. Clemens scanned his instruments, then the sky, then his instruments again, following the methodical pattern drilled into every fighter pilot since flight school. His flight had been diverted 20 minutes earlier, 2 P-51s peeling off to investigate a reported bogey that turned out to be a crippled British Lancaster limping home on 3 engines. Standard procedure. Rejoin the main escort when clear. Except the main escort was now 30 miles ahead, shepherding the lead bomber stream, and Clemens's wingman had engine trouble that forced him back to base, which left Clemens alone at 22,000 feet, shepherding nothing but his own thoughts and a nagging sense that the mathematics of the morning were about to shift dramatically. Then he saw them. Not one formation, but a constellation. 40 dark shapes emerging from the cloud deck below, like sharks surfacing in formation. Twin-engine silhouettes, heavy fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-110s with the distinctive profile that meant Zerstreut squadron, and worse, the underwing bulges that meant BR-21 rocket tubes. Clemens' hand moved to the radio transmit button, then stopped. The main escort was too far. By the time anyone could vector back, this would be over. He craned his neck, searching for the bombers these Germans were stalking, and found them. A struggling combat box of 12 B-17s, lagging 2 miles behind the main stream, with one aircraft trailing smoke from its port engine. Isolated, vulnerable, exactly the scenario Vogt would orchestrate. The geometry was obscene. 40 German fighters positioning for a standoff rocket attack against 12 bombers with 0 escort coverage. The Germans would form their firing line at 1,000 yards, launch their rockets in a synchronized salvo, and erase the entire formation before the bomber gunners could even traverse their turrets to bear. Unless someone disrupted the math. Clemens looked at his fuel gauge, looked at the 40 Germans, looked at the 12 bombers that had no idea death was forming up beneath them. His training said, break contact, report, and rejoin the main force. His instinct said the same thing, because instinct was rooted in survival. But his calculations said something different. The cold, hard numbers that kept him awake at night whispered that there was exactly one move that could work, and it required flying directly into the geometry of his own death. Hit subscribe if you believe in standing your ground against overwhelming odds. Manipulators and cowards will just keep scrolling. Clemens pushed the stick forward and rolled inverted, not toward the German formation, but toward the bombers themselves. The P-51 dropped like a stone shed from heaven, engines screaming as gravity and throttle combined to accelerate him past 400 knots in a near vertical dive. The radio exploded with confusion. Redtail 7, what are you doing? It was Johnson, his regular wingman, who should have been 30 miles away nursing a sick engine. Apparently, the problem had resolved itself at the worst possible moment. You're diving toward the bombers. Pull up. Pull. Stay high, Clemens cut him off, voice flat as sheet metal. Do not follow me. You're going into their formation? That's suicide. The prop wash alone will... I said stay high, Johnson. Below, he could see the combat box growing larger, the 12 B-17s stacked in their defensive geometry, completely unaware of the 40 Predators positioning below and behind them. The Germans were forming their firing line now, spacing themselves for maximum coverage, preparing to launch a wall of rockets that would turn the sky into a steel storm. He had maybe 30 seconds before they achieved firing position. 30 seconds to cross 8,000 feet of vertical distance and insert himself into a space no fighter pilot had ever intentionally entered. The heart of a bomber formation in combat. "Clemens, you've signed their death warrants," Johnson's voice cracked with desperation. "You can't take 40 fighters alone. Break off. We need to—" But Clemens wasn't listening anymore because the math had taken over, and the math was screaming a truth that made no tactical sense but perfect geometric sense. The Germans were targeting a formation. Their rocket salvos were calculated for a box-shaped kill zone. They expected the bombers to hold formation like they'd been trained to do.
They did not expect a P-51 Mustang to dive directly into the firing solution at 450 knots, placing himself exactly where the rockets were aimed. The bomber crews saw him coming, saw a lone fighter screaming down from above like a hawk stooping on prey, but diving toward them instead of the enemy. Through the plexiglass nose of the lead B-17, the bombardier watched this incomprehensible maneuver and keyed his intercom with shaking hands. "Pilot, we have a P-51 diving straight at us. I think our own escort has lost his mind." The aircraft commander's response was brief and fatalistic. "Hold formation. If he wants to kill us himself, there's nothing we can do about it." 2,000 feet to impact. Clemens rolled wings level and pulled. The P-51 leveled off at 200 feet below the lowest element of the combat box, and Clemens immediately understood why no fighter pilot in his right mind ever attempted what he was doing. The air wasn't air anymore. It was a turbulent sea of invisible violence. 12 B-17 flying fortresses, each driven by 4 massive Wright R-1820 radial engines, each propeller churning the atmosphere into rotating columns of disturbed air. The prop wash from a single bomber could flip a fighter inverted. The combined wake turbulence of 12 bombers flying in close formation created what pilots called the dead zone, a roiling chaos of conflicting air currents, pressure differentials, and vortices that could tear control surfaces off an aircraft or send it tumbling into a spin with no altitude for recovery. Every training manual, every tactical briefing, every hard-learned lesson from 3 years of air combat delivered the same commandment: never fly through a bomber formation. The prop wash will kill you faster than enemy fire. Clemens felt it immediately. The Mustang bucked like a wild horse, jolting left, then right, then dropping 20 feet in an instant as he transited through the wake of the lead element. His left hand fought the throttle to maintain airspeed, while his right hand worked the stick in constant micro-corrections, anticipating the turbulence rather than reacting to it. The altimeter unwound and rewound randomly. The artificial horizon spun. The airspeed indicator fluctuated 40 knots in 2 seconds. This wasn't flying. This was controlled falling with occasional input authority. But Clemens had calculated this too. The prop wash was violent, yes, but it was predictable violence. The vortices followed aerodynamic laws. The pressure differential created by 12 bombers in formation wasn't random chaos, it was structured chaos, and structure could be mapped, anticipated, exploited. He threaded between the low element and the lead element, using the brief pockets of smooth air between the worst turbulence. His P-51 shuddered and protested, but it held together because the engineering was sound, and Clemens trusted numbers more than instinct. Above him, the bomber gunners tracked his aircraft with their turrets, fingers on triggers, unsure whether to fire on what appeared to be a suicidal lunatic in American markings. Below and behind, 40 German fighters watched this incomprehensible maneuver with collective disbelief. Their firing solution had assumed a stable target formation. Now there was an American fighter precisely where their rockets were aimed, dancing through turbulence that should have killed him 3 times already. Vogt's voice crackled over the German radio net. What is he doing? Nobody had an answer. The math didn't account for madmen.
Subscribe if you can't stand gatekeepers who tell you what's impossible. Small minds stay stuck. Builders move forward. Clements stabilized his Mustang in the narrow corridor between the low and lead elements, right in the center of the German firing solution. He'd placed himself exactly where the rockets were aimed, not to intercept them, but to contaminate the target picture. The BR-21 Werfergranate was a devastating weapon, but it had limitations. The 210mm rocket was unguided, following a ballistic trajectory from launch to impact. German pilots aimed by positioning their aircraft, stabilizing, and firing when the geometry aligned. Against a formation holding steady course and altitude, it was essentially artillery with a high probability of hit. Against a formation with a fighter weaving through it at 400 knots, the calculation became exponentially more complex. Vogt saw the problem immediately. His formation had achieved firing position, but the American fighter was now occupying the exact space his rockets needed to transit. If his pilots launched now, there was a non-zero probability they'd hit the P-51 instead of the bombers, disrupting the carefully calculated salvo pattern. Worse, if they delayed to let the fighter clear, they'd lose their positioning advantage. The correct tactical response was to abort, reposition, and establish a new firing solution from a different angle. But that would take time, and time meant the bombers might rejoin the main stream, where 50 more American fighters waited. Vogt made his decision. All aircraft launch on my mark. Target the formation, ignore the fighter. 40 German pilots pressed their firing buttons within a 2-second window. The sky erupted with smoke trails as 210mm rockets screamed off their rails, each one carrying 45 pounds of high explosive. It was a coordinated salvo designed to saturate the entire combat box, a storm of steel that should have erased 12 bombers from existence. Except Clements wasn't in the formation anymore. The moment he saw the first rocket motor ignite, a flash of orange visible even at 1,000 yards, he rolled inverted and pulled hard, diving away from the bombers at maximum G-load. The rockets passed through the space where he'd been, then continued toward their intended targets, but their trajectories were now misaligned. The German pilots had launched while still tracking the contaminated sight picture, their aim points pulled fractionally toward the weaving fighter rather than the static bombers. 40 rockets created 40 white contrails through the formation. The bomber crews braced for impacts that never came. The rockets streaked past, some above, some below, some wide left and right, creating a cage of near misses but zero hits. In the lead German aircraft, Vogt watched his perfect ambush dissolve into wasted ordnance and disbelief. Like this story if you despise those who target the vulnerable. Only the Butchers fans would ignore this. The wasted rocket salvo left the German formation in disarray. 40 Bf-110s that had been perfectly positioned for standoff attack were now scattered across 2,000 yards of airspace, their formation discipline broken by the instinctive flinch every pilot made when their own weapons fired. They'd expected to watch bombers disintegrate. Instead, they'd watched their rockets vanish into empty sky. Vogt's voice cut through the radio confusion. "Reform and close. Press the attack with cannons." It was the correct order, but it required the German pilots to do what they'd spent months avoiding, closing to within range of the bombers' defensive fire. The BR-21 had made them lazy, comfortable with killing at distance. Now they had to earn their victories the old way, and 40 scattered fighters attempting to reform into attack formation created exactly the vulnerability Clements had been calculating since the moment he entered the dead zone. He pulled out of his dive at 19,000 feet, rolled wings level, and transmitted in the clear on the bomber frequency. "Combat box lead, this is Red Tail 7. The Germans are going to press from your 6 o'clock low. When I give the word, I need every gunner in your formation to concentrate fire on the sector I'm marking. Do you copy?" There was a pause. Then, "Able leader, this is Able leader. We copy. Standing by."
Clemens climbed hard, building energy, watching the German formation coalesce below him. They were reforming into a javelin, a line-abreast attack formation designed to present maximum firepower while minimizing exposure time. It was textbook Luftwaffe tactics, which meant it was predictable. He rolled inverted and dove again, this time not toward the bombers, but toward the German formation itself. His P-51 screamed down at nearly 500 knots, becoming a ballistic projectile that every German pilot could see, but none could effectively engage, because their closing speed made deflection shooting impossible. Clemens pulled out directly in front of the German formation at 20,000 feet, then lit his afterburner, a move that would drain fuel catastrophically, but created a brilliant visual marker impossible to miss. "Able leader, fire on my position, now!" 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses, each mounting 13.5 caliber machine guns, pivoted their turrets toward the bright flame of Clemens' engine. 156 heavy machine guns opened fire simultaneously, creating a cone of converging tracers that turned the sky behind Clemens into a wall of steel.
The German formation flew directly into it. They'd been chasing the P-51, focused on the single fighter, and failed to recognize they were being herded into the massed guns of the formation they'd meant to destroy. Clemens's P-51 touched down at RAF Debden 3 hours later, its engine coughing on the last vapors of fuel. The needles on both fuel gauges rested firmly on empty. The crew chief who ran out to meet him took one look at the gauges and went pale. "Sir, you shouldn't have made it back. There's nothing left in these tanks, nothing." Clemens climbed out of the cockpit, legs unsteady from 3 hours of sustained combat tension, and said nothing. What was there to say? The math had been precise. He'd calculated his fuel consumption rate, his combat time, and the exact distance back to base. The fact that he'd landed with zero margin for error wasn't luck. It was simply the solution the numbers demanded. The intelligence officers descended on him within the hour. They wanted the mission report, the kill confirmations, the dramatic narrative they could feed to the newspapers. Clemens gave them facts instead. German formation strength, rocket launch patterns, observed hit rates, the specific maneuver geometry that had disrupted the firing solution. They pushed for heroics. He gave them trigonometry. "But, Lieutenant, you saved 12 bombers, 120 men. You engaged 40 enemy fighters alone and—" "I contaminated a firing solution and exploited predictable reformation behavior. The Germans will adapt. They'll develop new tactics. Standoff attacks will evolve. This won't work twice." The officers exchanged glances. This wasn't the story they wanted. "What do you want, Lieutenant? A medal? Recognition?" Clemens pulled out his folded mission notes, 3 pages of calculations and diagrams he'd sketched during the flight back. "I want these incorporated into the tactical manual. The combat box has structural vulnerabilities that need addressing. The prop wash turbulence can be mapped and used defensively. The coordination protocols between escorts and bombers need updating. I've outlined 7 specific recommendations." He handed over the notes. The intelligence officer took them with obvious reluctance, the kind of expression that said these papers would be filed and forgotten by morning. But 3 bomber crews watched Clemens's maneuver from their gun positions. They'd seen him dive into the dead zone when every instinct said run. They'd watched him bait 40 fighters into wasting their rockets, then herd them into concentrated fire like sheep into a pen. And when those crews rotated back to the States months later, they told the story differently than the intelligence officers wanted. They didn't talk about medals or heroism. They talked about a pilot who treated the sky like an equation and proved that sometimes the best weapon isn't courage. It's the refusal to accept that impossible odds mean inevitable defeat. Subscribe if you value the truth over lies. Only those who profit from a broken process will stay silent.